Russell Norman.
Oh, thank you, Mr Chair, and thank you, Jacinda. Mr Chair, we were talking about the role of free trade agreements and increasing the sale of dairy into China and also via Hong Kong, but particularly directly to China. And the fact that the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement has nothing whatsoever to do with the fact that we've had an increase in dairy sending to China, but in fact it's all to do with the Sanlu disaster. Now, one of the things that people don't realise is that Sanlu had this was working jointly with Fonterra when the Sanlu was basically directed by the Chinese Communist Party not to talk about the fact that they were killing children with their melamine-infected milk products that they were selling to Chinese parents, which was killing children across China and making many children in China very, very sick. But the Chinese Communist Party directed that they weren't to discuss anything to do with food safety in the lead-up to the Olympics because they didn't want any disturbance of the positive propaganda they were getting around the world in the Olympics. And so the Chinese Communist Party committee that controlled Sanlu decided that they wouldn't do a full recall. They had then had a board meeting of Sanlu where there was a Fonterra representative, and at that board meeting, which was the legal formal structure that controlled Sanlu, they made a decision that they would do a full recall, or at least that's what the Fonterra representative said. The Fonterra representative was on the phone on the board meeting. At that point, actually what happened is the Chinese Communist Party then overruled the board and in fact decided to not have a full recall. And this is the reality that stands behind dealing with China. So there are many people who look at the formal legal structures, such as the board of Sanlu, but in fact if you want to have a proper understanding of what kind of relationship it is we have with China, then you need to look at the fact that it is the Chinese Communist Party.
Order. Now leave us sought for a wide-ranging debate over the 4 clauses within this bill, and I'm kind of struggling a wee bit to see the relevance of the member's point. So, order. Member will take a walk if he's not careful. Now, I'm being as lenient as I can, but I'd ask the member to make it relevant to the 4 clauses. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. The relevance, for those who are struggling to see it, Mr Chair, is that there has been much discussion in this debate, which you have allowed, which is that these free trade agreements increase trade with China. That has been the argument made. In fact, it's not true. It's just what people argue. But in fact, if you look at the facts of the matter, what you discover is that the increase in trade to which people have been referring to in the debate you have been allowing is actually due to the fact of the Sanlu disaster and has nothing whatsoever to do with the arguments that people have been making, which is that it's because of the free trade agreement. You can only understand the Sanlu disaster if you understand the role of the Chinese Communist Party within that company. It had nothing to do with the formal legal structures that people imagine they're working with in China, such as the board of Sanlu, and these are the kind of legal structures we're dealing with, when in fact the real people that controlled Sanlu was the Chinese Communist Party. And it may be of interest to people in trying to understand what kind of relationship we're developing with China through these free trade agreements and other kind of relationships, that in fact what Sanlu then did was that they paid an organisation called Baidu to censor all of the internet searches for Sanlu and milk powder. So in fact what happened was that all of the searches from parents inside China who were trying to understand what was going on were censored because Sanlu paid for them to be censored. And that's the basis on which people became poisoned, and then that resulted in a big increase in New Zealand's sales of milk products to China, which had nothing whatsoever to the free trade agreement that people think had something to do with it. In fact, Chinese parents were desperate for safe food to give to their children because of the Sanlu disaster. The reason the Sanlu disaster happened was because of the control of the Chinese Communist Party over the board of Sanlu. Even though formally speaking the board was in control, in fact it was the CCP branch within Sanlu that controlled that organisation. If you don't believe me, then I would suggest you read something about it. There's a very good book called The Party, which explains the role of the Chinese Communist Party by Richard McGregor, who was a journalist for the Financial Times and spent many years living in China. If you read that book, it mentions Sanlu at some length. and explains why it was that the New Zealand government was duped into believing that it was the board of Sanlu that controlled that organisation, when in fact it was the Chinese Communist Party that controlled that organisation. Now, Labor and National do deals with what they think is the government, the President and the Prime Minister and all the rest. Of course, the people that control what happens in China is the Chinese Communist Party. The government officials are merely the front. Mr. Chair.
Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so the people that you're doing, that the Labor and National Party are doing deals with when they go and develop these, they think they're doing a deal with, say, Hu Jintao, the President of China. In fact, Hu Jintao has his power because he is the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party.
Dr. Hutchison.
Talking of a free trade agreement with China, the bill we are on is the New Zealand-Hong Kong partnership, economic partnership agreement. He is out of order.
Yeah. I'll hear the member make an explanation.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Hong Kong Free Trade Agreement is brought into force as a result of this bill. This is one part of bringing it into force. It is the parallel agreement to the China one. So all of us have been discussing both together because they're intimately connected.
Well, look, the member's entitled to discuss other things for comparative purposes, but the whole thrust of the member's speech is not relevant really to the bill. And unless he comes back to it, I'll terminate the speech. Russell Norman.
And so this bill, by changing the tariff regime in New Zealand, implements the content of the Hong Kong deal, the so-called free trade deal. Of course, it's not actually a free trade deal. Anyone who knows anything about trade policy knows that this is a preferential trade deal, but that's kind of irrelevant because most people voting on this don't know anything about trade policy. And so it's actually a preferential deal, and that is it creates a preferential treatment between goods between New Zealand, services between New Zealand and Hong Kong. But this bill implements that preferential trade deal. Now, the parallel agreement that goes alongside this is the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement, which is also a preferential trade deal between New Zealand and China. These two agreements sit side by side, and this bill implements some components, only a small element of actually the Hong Kong-New Zealand preferential trade deal, because only a small element actually requires legislation to be changed. The large bulk of the Hong Kong-New Zealand preferential trade deal doesn't require legislation. It's only the parts around the tariffs in particular that need changing. Of course, we already send our goods into Hong Kong tariff-free, and so while we're reducing our tariffs, they're not reducing theirs because they don't need to, because we don't actually need any of this agreement to get our goods into Hong Kong tariff-free, but let's put that to one side because we all like to believe in the myth that we do. So the problem we have when we're signing up to these agreements with China is that we imagine that with this deal we're signing up to something looks like our government. So we think our government is signing an agreement with the Hong Kong government or the China government, as the case may be. But in fact, in China, things don't work like that. The governments there are actually the puppets, if you like. They're the puppets of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party are the puppet masters, and anyone who knows anything about the way China works will know that in fact it is the Communist Party that determines what happens. And when we look at these parallel structures, which look like New Zealand government structures, we think they're very similar on the face of it, but in fact they're not. They're quite different structures, which are secretly and entirely under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. For example, I mean, just to give you one example, just in case there are some doubters of this, Liu Gan, who was a Politburo Standing Committee until 2007, which is the body that controls the Chinese Communist Party, said, "There's no question where legal departments should stand. The correct stand is where the party stands." That is that the courts in China are required to give the verdicts that the Chinese Communist Party directs them to give. The courts are entirely under the control of the party. And if you don't understand that the nature of China is different to the nature of New Zealand, that in fact all of the institutions, the media, the courts are all under the control of the party, that they are not separate institutions, then you don't understand what you're dealing with when you are negotiating deals like this one. And that's what happened to Fonterra with Sanlu, is they didn't understand that's what they were dealing with. And in negotiating this deal, you don't understand that you're not negotiating with a government that works the same way as the New Zealand government. So when you sign up to this deal, you're not getting what you think you're getting. because the way China works is very different to the way New Zealand works. And that's why New Zealand has made so many mistakes in dealing with China. The Sandloo is simply the worst of it. And that's why we'll continue to make mistakes until we understand exactly what it is that we're dealing with when we sign up to treaties like this.
The question is that clauses 1 to 4 stand part. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Well, Clerk